Hello everyone and welcome. Prusa just came out with the OCL, the Open Community License, and right away they used it for publishing the CAD files for the Core 1 and the Core 1L. And on the surface, it's stupidly simple license terms. It's just one page. This is the core of the license. As a non-commercial end user, you may use, copy, modify, and hack the products and/or its components as you wish. You should share your creations and modifications, and you must share your creations and other derivative works under the OCL, or another license that has the same permissions as the OCL. So far, so good. I mean, sounds kind of like GNU GPL-like, right? But as a commercial business user, you may use the product and modify it for use case solely for your internal production use. You must not modify the product for any commercial purpose other than your internal production use, and you must not copy or replicate the product or its components for any commercial purpose other than your internal right to repair without obtaining a business license or repair license. That's it. Almost. I skipped over the preamble and postamble, and yes, that's a word. And we'll look at those in a second. What's interesting with the OCL is that Prusa attributes quite a few benefits to it. It's simple. It's just a single page. It explicitly mentions patents in a separate paragraph that would still apply and possibly restrict what you can do, even if you can use the CAD files themselves. But also, it's supposed to help in cases where outside patent trolls register the original creators' designs and then extort them for license fees for their own original designs. We'll look at whether the OCL actually delivers on those claims. But notably, designs published under the OCL are not technically open source. The Open Source Hardware Association, whose open source hardware logo Joe Prusa literally wears on his sleeve, does not consider a license compatible with the open source terminology when it doesn't provide the same basic freedoms both to private and to commercial users, which the OCL explicitly doesn't do. It's complicated. The open source ecosystem is already plenty complicated already, so I've been spending the last couple of days trying to understand just what the situation is, what the OCL tries to do, and what it actually can do and does do. I've gone back and forth a couple times with the Prusa team about the things that I find questionable about the OCL, and we'll dig through all of this right after a note from today's sponsor. While it is pretty amazing how much you can do yourself with 3D printing these days, there are still some parts that will need to perform a little bit better than what you can realistically do at home. So just get them made by today's sponsor, PCBWay. They make it super easy to order not just PCBs and 3D prints, but also CNC machine parts from aluminum, steel, titanium, or plastics. They also do flat or ready-to-use bent sheet metal parts made to your specs, machined carbon fiber plate, or even batch-produced injection molding. Being able to rely on PCBWay to use affordable, high-performance parts for your builds and projects is an absolute game-changer for what you can achieve. So check out how you can profit from using PCBWay at the link below. Okay, I do need to start out with a couple of clarifications. When a manufacturer releases open hardware under a specific license, first of all, it means that they're typically granting the user extra rights in addition to the rights that the user already has for anything they own, open hardware or not. Anything in this video is based on my understanding of the German law, which is the law that applies to me. That's going to be fairly similar throughout the EU, and interpreting the license text itself should be the same anywhere in the world, though it's not exact, so it does make a difference. But I'm not a lawyer, and none of this is legal advice. For that, I'm sure the comment section below is going to be very helpful. When you, someone else, or a company create anything, the usage rights to that creation, to that IP, are spread out into at least 5 different aspects. Copyright covers the unique, specific, and in the greater sense, the artistic expression of your thoughts. So for a technical drawing, not the thing that it's describing, but literally the drawing itself, or the motif of a painting, but notably not the physical canvas, the paint, and the frame. Those are just technical parts to it. If you create products that have a certain recognizable style or recurring design elements, those can be registered as a design patent. And that protects those elements from being imitated, and it expands past the specific expression and can also apply to a styling that may not be considered art under copyright. Then Regular patents can be granted for a purely technical solution to a problem, and specifically for the novel concept and the idea itself of how to solve that problem. If you have a brand with a unique and recognizable name or logo, those two can be registered as a trademark. And while those four so far don't apply to the purely physical materials of a product that you own yet, so it doesn't apply to like the printer itself, there may be additional terms of use or contracts under private law that a buyer signs with a seller or manufacturer before they agree to a transaction. It's not part of IP in the sense, but it does come into play here as well. This is what a license to a published file would be, and it can modify which rights the original creator retains to those four elements. Though legally, I understand that that is quite thin ice, and manufacturers or sellers only have very limited ways of governing what you can do or can't do with something that you own. Maybe a couple examples. I want to reference this banger of an XKCD strip. Randall Munroe owns the copyright to that comic, so normally for referencing it, I wouldn't be allowed to copy it into my own video and redistribute it. But because things are never as simple as they seem, copyright has an exception for this exact use case called fair use. And Randall also kindly decided to allow the use of XKCD material under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial 2.5 license terms. Is this already considered commercial use? I don't know, maybe. What if Prusa sells you a printer but also publishes the design files under the OCL terms? You own the physical printer and you can do with it whatever you want. You can mod it, tune it, even as a business, you have that right. And you can also resell it if you want. But because Prusa Research also owns a trademark, you might get into trouble, if those trademarks end up on something that doesn't exactly represent the product from Prusa anymore. When you download the design files though, you agree to the terms of the OCL. And those terms might not only touch the design files themselves, but could also count as a private law contract that governs details outside of just using the files themselves. For example, I have licensed the music in my videos from Epidemic Sound, and the contract you enter with them gives you permission to use the music tracks, but also requires you to regularly provide payment to them if you want to keep using their service and want to keep getting new tracks to use in your new content. That's simply voluntarily entering into a contract that provides both parties with, some agreed upon set of benefits. The default for anything that gets put out there without an explicit license attached to it is all rights reserved if it falls under copyright, meaning that there are no rights granted beyond the legal minimum. The complete opposite of that would be releasing a work into the public domain, which means no rights reserved. The creator is waiving all rights they have to their creation. Permissive or copyleft licenses like MIT, GPL, CERN, TAPR, Creative Commons, and the OCL as well, fall somewhere between those two extremes, and they allow for a limited scope of use with specific conditions attached. For example, if you build a product from GPL licensed software and then distribute that software to someone else, you're required to also provide them with your modified software source code under the same GPL license terms. It's a give and take. You take some and you give some rights away. Unfortunately, a lot of the existing license templates are not really made for hardware products. MIT and GPL mostly apply to software, and Creative Commons is more focused on art. And for that, it's pretty simple. You use someone's photo in a design or print it onto a canvas, that's still the same photo. But when it comes to hardware, turning a drawing into a physical object is typically considered a transformation. So even though the CAD files might be under one specific license, as soon as a physical product is manufactured from them, that product is now a different thing. Copyright doesn't apply to things that are simply there for function, and only to the parts that fall under the abstract idea of creative expression. I know that's vague, but that's why it's difficult. I believe the common interpretation is that a drawing or a CAD design itself generally does fall under copyright, but for physical parts, produced from those files or not, there's a pretty high threshold for when they're considered creative and not just functional, aka, not protected under copyright. This has been a point of contention ever since open source hardware became a thing, and the only way I would see that solved is by turning what used to be a license just concerning the design files themselves into a larger contract that would have the user agree to all sorts of terms that extend past just the original design or file that they download. That, of course, would have its own massive set of pitfalls. So let's look at the OCL. Piece by piece. First sentence. OCL pertains to, which means applies to, intellectual property distributed under the OCL terms. So same here, applies to IP. Let's stick to CAD drawings for the core one. Let's use that as an example. The OCL also explains that when they say intellectual property, they don't mean just the copyright on those CAD files, but also design and patent. It also explains that the IP is applied by the licensor, Prusa in this case, in their products and components, both hardware and software. So that would be the Core 1 hardware in this case for the CAD files. Firmware, I guess as well, it could also count cloud services, Prusa Slicer, and anything that is using that intellectual property. And this is where it just gets utterly confusing to me, because the license doesn't ever give clear permissions and limitations for how we can use the IP itself, but only ever refers to products and components. So if I'm reading this correctly, in the case of the Core 1, you agree to the OCL terms when you download the CAD files, but the OCL doesn't actually govern how you can use those files themselves. It only governs how you can use the product and components, where Prusa applied their IP. So really, I download the source files, and now I've agreed to limiting what I can do with the Core 1 printer, the hardware that I already have, because again, all the terms apply to products and components. Unless you also consider the CAD files themselves to have sort of the IP applied to itself, then yes, it would also apply to those CAD files. Look, this interpretation is obviously stupid. I can't imagine that that's actually what Prusa meant when setting out that license. For non-commercial users, sure, okay, after you've agreed to the OCL, you'd have to publish any mod or add-on that you design for the Core 1 exclusively under OCL. And I don't think that's too bad, but it is a very high degree of virality of the OCL license. But for a business user, which I think would apply to me as well, I would agree to use and modify my Core 1, Core 1L, and any other product where that IP is applied, only for internal production use, whatever that means, and to never copy or replicate it other than for my internal right to repair, which is ironic because it clashes with the external right to repair that companies here, Germany, have by law that allows them to produce fully compatible spare parts based on reverse engineering the originals. Of course, here in Germany, that is most often applied to car parts because everything revolves around cars here for some reason. And it allows replacement part manufacturers to make, brake calipers, fenders, interior panels exclusively for the use as spare parts. Companies have that right, but of course they also have the right to voluntarily give that up and, limit their use of Prusa's products and components to internal production use only. Legally, I think you can totally make that agreement, but Jesus, that would be pretty overbearing. You're basically signing at least a non-compete by downloading the CAD files, because if you can't replicate anything from the Core 1, does that mean you can't just, make an exact copy of the Core 1, or does it mean you literally can't replicate a filament extruder or an M3x12 screw going into a square nut? The license says products and components, which is the whole thing, not just the parts covered that Prusa would have the copyright to in the original IP, in the CAD files that he downloaded. So I've asked Prusa about this, and they were like, no, the OCL doesn't touch any of the rights that you have to the hardware that you own, which I don't think is what the license actually says. So let's just assume I'm misunderstanding the introduction paragraph. But then why would it specifically refer to products and or its components as hardware and software? But let's just stick with the idea that products and or components is actually supposed to mean the CAD source files themselves, because then cool, as a business user, you can totally use those files for internal production use. So you can just totally produce a perfect Core 1 clone from those files. That's internal production use if I've ever seen it. The only thing that you couldn't do is to copy or replicate those CAD files, which, okay, thinking about it, that is kind of hard to comply with. you know what downloading a file does? It's copying that file to your computer, including all the IP that is contained within it. So is that copy process still covered under the original license? You're also going to apply for a business license if you ever want to create a backup of the computer that file is stored on. So surely that also can't be how the license is supposed to be interpreted. And when legal documents are so ambiguous that you can't possibly know what you're actually agreeing to, I just don't think that it would hold up particularly well when it comes to enforcing those license terms, which ultimately happens in court. And court cases are something that Prusa is talking about when it comes to defending the rights of creators publishing the designs under the OCL. The case of Sousaphone, where a patent troll registers someone else's design and then demands license fees from the original author, Prusa say if Sousaphone would have published under the OCL, then the angle wouldn't just be getting the patent itself cancelled and terminated, because obviously there already was prior art, but the original creator could also claim breach of contract, which they're saying is an easier lawsuit to win. But I just don't think that the OCL is clear enough about what is actually being licensed. Like, what is the IP? What is the product? And in Sousaphone's case, was there even a product that the OCL would apply to? I just don't see how that would be any easier. Plus, if you want to enforce a breach of contract, you'd first have to prove that, the patent troll, the other party, actively agreed to those terms, to the contract, which I imagine might be easier said than done when it's just a download button. One of the aspects of intellectual property that the OCL does touch on, but is also quite unclear about, is patents and design patents. Because what you could absolutely do is publish a design under a very permissive license, but still have your own patents essentially keep anyone from using that design. The OCL specifically mentions that by licensing some intellectual property as OCL, that, quote, all licensors' copyrights, designs, and patents, as far as relevant to the product or its components under OCL, are community open. So, taking that term literally, which you kind of have to when it's about legal documents, Prusa published the CAD files, the IP in question, for the Core 1 under the terms of the OCL. But then there's that extra step of looking at the product where that IP was applied to, and looking at the copyright and the patents and the design patents that apply to that. And then these are community open. In the EU, the CAD files themselves could also be considered, a product. In the US, most likely they are not, but this only applies to products under OCL. And the very first sentence of the license establishes that the OCL only applies to IP, which is then used in a product. So product and IP are two different things. And the OCL is only ever applied to an IP, not to the product. So what products exactly are we looking at here? I don't know. And I couldn't find where Prusa publishes their database of products licensed under the OCL as required by the license. And then what even is community open? It's not explained anywhere either. Am I community? Am I a business user? Is that different? Am I both? For research and private use, patents don't apply anyway. They're only relevant for commercial purposes. And the patent texts and drawings themselves are already openly accessible for anyone. So I don't know. I think there's a reason why Creative Commons by NC 4.0, so Attribution Non-Commercial 4.0, is almost 20,000 characters. GNU GPL is over 35,000 characters. Only the MIT license is this short at just over 1,000 characters, but all it says is, do what you want, but if it breaks, it's not our fault. Which, by the way, that sort of limitation of liability is not a part of OCL. Look, I'll be the first to acknowledge that running a business with a true open source mindset might just be impossible at scale. If you give up the thing that makes your product better than the rest, guess what? By the time that you can say unique selling point, it's not going to be unique anymore. Out in the wild, I'm really only seeing 3 kinds of open source projects that end up sticking around. And I'm not talking about like the open core subscription-based mentality that software as a service is nowadays. Successful projects are those that are small enough or mature enough so that competition sees no point in cloning it and commercializing it. Those that are run by volunteers who just have no commercial interest, and those that are backed by large corporations because they profit more from external contributions and testing, or from their library being, the standard, than what it would cost them to develop it in-house as closed source. Or of course a combination of all of them. Businesses that are themselves successfully publishing as open source are almost never sharing their actual product, the thing that they make their money with, which ideally they then use to pay their employees. Prusa trying to find a way to share the designs for their printers is laudable, for sure, though over the years, and as 3D printing has shifted from mostly community-developed ideas to mostly corporate-designed machines, I'm having a harder and harder time just seeing the value in demanding everything to be released as true open-source hardware. Especially looking at what sort of strain that puts on the companies trying to do it properly in a way that isn't just, wishy-washy, let's dump our source code onto GitHub and call it compliant. The bigger focus, and I think the more realistic goal today, should be demanding that you actually own the products that you buy, meaning that they're not tied to manufacturer cloud services, that they're compatible with open standards like regular, non-encrypted G-code, and have documented APIs for things like network functionality. Also, the product itself should be provided to you in a functional state and not with a "we'll fix it later in a firmware update" sort of promise. Make no mistake, the OCL is not an open source license. In fact, taking it literally, it isn't much of a license for the source files themselves, but a list of restrictions that you agree to for how you can use the product and components. I don't think that this was intentional, but the way it's written right now, it's too vague, it's too contradictory, it's missing terms on liability. I just don't think it's a particularly good license in its current state. And for the bigger picture, I don't think many people have noticed, but Prusa has had a shift in their branding and moved from calling their printers the original Prusa Mark III to just calling them Prusa Core 1. Supposedly, dropping the original tag is indicating that the machines are not truly open source hardware anymore. Again, I think that's fine. Prusa has been a massively positive influence on the 3D printing scene, and I'm rooting for them to find a model that works for them and allows them to continue doing that, even when the 3D printer market keeps changing as fast as it does. After all, Prusa are the only manufacturer that I know of who's putting in the work to even try and find that solution in the first place. But to my understanding, the OCL just isn't that solution yet. Cool. Yeah, hope you all had a good year. Thanks for being an awesome community that I get to be a part of. As always, take care of yourselves, keep on making, and I'll see you all next year.